And now, part 3 of On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. So we continue with Thoreau's view of taxes, and being in jail for one night for not paying his taxes seemed to have made a lasting impression on him. So he considers an objection against his view, and he says, when millions, without any ill will on their part, demand of you a few shillings, his expression for a little bit of money, without any possibility of retracting their demand, and without the possibility of you appealing to all these other millions of people, why expose yourself to this overwhelming brute force? And in his objection, he draws an analogy to natural forces. He says, obviously, you, Thoreau, do not resist natural forces so obstinately. That is, for example, he doesn't stick his head into a fire. And so the gist of this objection is there's nothing you can do, about this. The millions of people, you can't really address them. It's just too much to resist. The state is essentially a force of nature, so why bother? So his reply is this. He notes, seemingly correctly, that this is not just a brute force, but a human force. And that he has, even though there's millions of other people, he has relations with them as people, not as mere brute or inanimate things, so he can appeal to them. He can appeal to them, he seems to reference God here, the maker of them, and he can appeal to them as people. Now, responding to the analogy of the fire, yes, if he puts his head into the fire, he can't appeal to the fire or the maker, presumably God. He only has himself to blame because, the fire is totally not a creature at all, so putting his head in the fire, nothing to appeal to. That would be dumb. However, in the case of, humans, he can resist with some effect because they're not simply just, a burning fire, force of nature. They're people and they can be influenced. So a reasonable point. Now, in terms of the authority of the state, he has the following conception of political authority. So he takes the government, and he's referring to the United States, during the 1800s, he takes the authority of that government to be impure. And to be properly just, it must have the sanction and consent of the governed. And he does raise an interesting point, that the state can have no pure right over his person and property, but what he concedes to it. And so on the one hand, given, say, American political philosophy, at least what is professed, he does seem to be right, because if we take the Lockean model, you have to consent to the government in order to have a right over you. And even when we looked at Socrates and the Crito, that was his view as well, that one must enter into agreement with the state that is led by neither force nor fraud. So on one hand, this does make sense. One must concede to the state and grant it the right, otherwise without the consent of the governed, on this conception of legitimacy of authority, the state would have no right. But then, of course, there's kind of a counter problem, which is, wouldn't this allow for some sort of exploit where a person could simply, withdraw their consent, and thus, in kind of a silly case, be able to do bad stuff and then get away with it by, withdrawing their consent. And so that could be, I guess, some kind of concern. But Thoreau takes the view that, it must be based on the consent of the governed, and it seems to be up to him whether he concedes or not. So he does note, he takes a view of the state as a matter of progress. Not surprisingly, Americans often tend to have this view about the progression of government, and of course anybody who looks at history might also tend to have this view. And he notes, looking at kind of probably like British history, it transitions from an absolute monarchy to a limited monarchy, and from a limited monarchy to a democracy. And he thinks that there is an arc of progression. So he takes an individualistic view, that the individual is the basis of the empire, and that the state exists for the individual as opposed to the opposite. And he thinks that even though when we reach democracy, like kind of exists in the United States, depending on how you define it, he thinks it's not the sort of final form of possible in government. He thinks one can go even further towards recognizing and organizing people's right. And he takes the view, which is typically states, of course, are generally not going to probably accept, that there'll never be a properly free and enlightened state until it allows and recognizes the individual as a higher and independent power, from which it derives its own power and authority and treats them accordingly. And he believes that even in the democracy of his time, the state fails to do this, and that the state does not properly treat individuals. Now, looking at the United States today, one can make the case that, well, certain people, of course, do get treated very well by the government. And other people, of course, are often victims of the government. And depending on one's politics, that sort of determines the narrative one has as to who is the victim of the state and who is not the victim of the state, who benefits. So he thinks the state can keep progressing, and he imagines a state that could be just to all people, treat the individual with respect as a neighbor. And this is kind of the most extreme part, that except if a few people were to live within the boundaries of the state, but live apart from it. Now, this would require, as Thoreau notes, that the people who choose to live apart from the state would not, meddle with the state or interfere with it, and they would not be, controlled by the state. Now, he's, again, an anarchist, not like someone who advocates like chaos and madness. And so he believes that if people exist apart from the state, not accepting its authority, they would still be under moral obligations, namely duties to their neighbors as neighbors and duties to people in general as people. So even though anarchism often gets characterized as just, violence and chaos, which, to be fair, some anarchists do advocate violence, and one could be an anarchist and advocate, like, presumably some chaos, Thoreau has a very sort of kinder, gentler view of it, that, again, the resistance is not violent, it's civil disobedience, and even, when a person lives apart from the state, they still operate under moral obligations as people. Now, in terms of the practicality of this, it seems kind of unlikely that a state would allow people to live apart from it in this way, even if they agreed not to meddle, because the state, by its very nature, is generally seen as having to have sort of, sovereign authority over everyone within its borders. But it is an interesting notion that a person would have, potentially the right to just kind of opt out on being part of the state, but still, not be like obviously like a criminal or doing terrible, terrible stuff. And the idea is essentially opting out. Now, this also leads to kind of an interesting question about, Thoreau focuses quite a bit on taxes and payment and so forth. Kind of the question of, would you have a right not to pay taxes, not to contribute to the state, if you didn't accept the benefits? Now, one argument could be made is one that's been made by obviously other people, which is kind of the payment for services approach. The idea being that whatever goods and services the state provides you, that you accept, that you pay for them, just like you would presumably pay like your water bill if you get water, or a bill at a restaurant, like if you have lunch and so forth, that you pay your bill. And that services that you did not want and did not use, you wouldn't have to pay for. Now, as a business model, of course, in terms of like being billed by a business, that does seem to make sense because, for example, if you go to a restaurant and you order a hamburger, some fries, and say a milkshake, and then you get your bill and they put like the table next to yours on your bill, or part of it, like you're paying for their French fries in addition to your own, you would be right to say, hey, there's a mistake on my bill. Those are not my fries. They're somebody else's. I don't owe this. And so on one hand, that would make sense. You pay for the goods and services that you use. So as a concrete example, if you did not use the schools, you did not have kids in school, then you, I guess, would not pay the taxes for, school. Although, of course, presumably you'd have to pay off, if you're going on a services provided, presumably you would have to repay for your education. Or you might say, hey, my parents took care of that, so I don't know anything because my parents paid that, presumably. So on the plus side, one could say that makes sense, being, outside of the state, but again, acting in a moral way, not being, doing crimes and hurting people and so forth. Just kind of like his view, or kind of what he did with living out on Walden Pond, apart from the state. Now, kind of on the minus side, one could argue that even if people just sort of opted out on things they didn't think they used, then they would opt out on, like, as a practical matter, lots of things, maybe even things they actually used, like, roads and so forth. And one could argue that even though one might not have, like, kids in school, a person does benefit from that, because if they own a business, these schools are training the people that later become their workers, etc. And so there is kind of the question about, does paying to the state benefit you? Now, one could also note, as Thoreau himself does, is that, being a good neighbor involves paying for things that you yourself might not use, so goods and services that don't directly benefit you, which is kind of an interesting question about excluding oneself from the state. Typically, people want to exclude themselves in, like, selfish ways, but Thoreau seems to be advocating a non-selfish way. And he believes that ultimately, if we have a state that allows people to live apart from it, which seems incredibly unlikely, that this would prepare the way for what he calls a more perfect and glorious state. So that takes us to the end, look at our good dead friend, Henry David Thoreau, and his view of civil disobedience.